The crystal caves beneath Vethra Prime echoed with the sound of dripping water and Zaravel's labored breathing. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes, trying to block out the constant buzzing in her head. The voices of her people floated down from the floating cities above, a symphony of connected minds that she could never truly join. Her neural pathways were wrong, twisted in ways that made the collective consciousness reject her like a foreign infection. Every attempt to connect with other Kireni brought waves of agony that left her gasping on the ground. The pain had been with her since birth, marking her as void-touched, defective, broken. Zaravel opened her mismatched eyes and looked at her reflection in a pool of mineral water. One eye was the traditional silver of her people, but the other burned with an unnatural gold that made other Kireni recoil in disgust. Her skin was paler than it should be, with strange patterns that shifted and moved like living tattoos. She was everything the Kireni feared becoming. The sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze. Heavy boots echoed through the tunnels, accompanied by the mechanical whir of scanning equipment. The purification squads were hunting again. Zaravel gathered her meager belongings and crept deeper into the ruins, her bare feet silent on the ancient stone. She had been living in these forgotten tunnels for 3 cycles now, ever since the Council declared her too dangerous to remain in the outer settlements. High Telepath Morthane himself had pronounced judgment on her, his voice cold and final as he stripped away her citizen status. Her own family had watched without protest. As the guards dragged her away, the ruins told stories of a different time, when her people had been individuals instead of a collective mind. Ancient carvings showed Kirani with varied features and different colored eyes, but the current generation refused to acknowledge this history. They had achieved perfect unity by eliminating imperfection, and Zaravel was a reminder of what they had left behind. Her stomach growled as she navigated the familiar passages. Food was scarce in the underground, consisting mainly of biocrystals that grew in the deepest chambers, and whatever scraps she could steal from the surface. The crystals provided basic nutrition but tasted like metal and left her feeling weak. Sometimes she wondered if it would be easier to surrender to the purification squads and end the constant struggle, but something inside her refused to give up. The same fractured neural pathways that caused her pain also gave her abilities the collective consciousness couldn't understand. She could interface with the ancient technology scattered throughout the ruins, machines that had been silent for generations suddenly responding to her touch. The old computers whispered secrets to her in languages the modern Kireni had forgotten. Above her, the floating cities drifted across the crystal sky like jeweled islands. Their undersides glowed with soft bioluminescence, powered by the collective will of millions of connected minds. Zaravel had once dreamed of walking those pristine streets and breathing the purified air, but that dream had died the first time she tried to join the consciousness and nearly collapsed from the feedback. The footsteps were getting closer. Zaravel pressed herself into a hidden alcove as 3 purification guards rounded the corner. Their faces were hidden behind neural interface masks that connected them directly to the hunting protocols. They moved with mechanical precision, scanning every shadow and crevice with their detection equipment. One of them paused near her hiding spot and tilted his head, listening to instructions from the collective. His scanner swept the area inches from where she crouched, but the ancient shielding in the ruins confused their equipment. After a tense moment, they moved on deeper into the tunnels. Zaravel waited until their footsteps faded before emerging from her hiding place. She knew they would be back with stronger equipment and more hunters. The net was closing around her and the other outcasts who lived in the depths. Soon there would be nowhere left to run. She made her way to the central chamber where the others gathered when it was safe. There were 12 of them in total, all marked by the same neural defects that made them outcasts. Some were children who had been abandoned by their families. Others were adults who had developed problems later in life. They looked up hopefully when she entered, but she had no good news to share. Old Kevmorn spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. He had been a respected engineer before his neural implant malfunctioned and cut him off from the collective. Now he was just another void-touched hiding in the dark. He told them that the purification squads had found the eastern tunnels and sealed them with plasma charges. Their safe spaces were shrinking. Young Narration began to cry, her underdeveloped telepathic abilities making her emotions leak into the minds of those nearby. She was only 8 cycles old but already marked for elimination because her neural pathways had failed to properly form. Her parents had abandoned her at the tunnel entrance with nothing but a note apologizing for their shame. Zaravel knelt beside the child and tried to offer comfort, but her broken abilities made the connection painful for both of them. She could only provide the warmth of physical touch, something the collective-minded Kirani had largely abandoned. The girl clung to her desperately, finding solace in simple human-like contact. As she held Narration, Zaravel felt the familiar stirring in her damaged neural pathways. Images flashed through her mind, fragments of something happening far above. She saw massive metal ships approaching Vethra Prime, vessels unlike anything in the Kirani fleet. The collective consciousness was buzzing with excitement and concern. About these newcomers who called themselves humans, the visions came in broken pieces, too fragmented for her to understand completely. She saw bipedal creatures with diverse features and individual minds that refused to connect to any greater network. The collective found them fascinating and terrifying, like looking at an evolutionary path not taken. These humans seemed to embrace the very individuality that the Kirani had spent centuries eliminating. Zaravel didn't know what these visions meant, but something deep inside her stirred with an emotion she hadn't felt in years. Hope, perhaps? In this vast universe there were others who didn't fit into perfect collective harmony. Perhaps she wasn't as alone as she had always believed. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the TDF Valor and watched the crystal world grow larger on the main screen. Vethra Prime glittered like a jewel against the darkness of space, its floating cities casting rainbow patterns across the planet's surface. He had seen many worlds during his 15 years in the Terran Defense Fleet, but none quite like this one. His second officer, Lieutenant Amy Chun, looked up from her console with a worried expression. The Kirani had been sending complex telepathic signals since they entered the system, but the human crew couldn't interpret them. Their translators were working overtime, trying to decode the alien communication patterns that seemed more like shared thoughts than actual words. Jake ran a hand through his graying hair and studied the tactical display. 3 massive Kirani vessels had emerged from behind the planet's largest moon, their crystalline hulls pulsing with bioluminescent energy. They moved with perfect coordination, like parts of a single organism rather than separate ships. It reminded him uncomfortably of the hive mind species humanity had encountered in the Centauri sector. The memory of the Proxima Wars still haunted his dreams. He had led a squad of 12 good soldiers into what should have been a simple rescue mission. Only he had walked out alive, carrying the weight of their deaths like chains around his soul. Command had promoted him for his survival, but Jake knew the truth. He had failed them when they needed him most. Lieutenant Amy Chun broke his dark thoughts with a gentle touch on his shoulder. She had served under him for 3 years and could read his moods better than most. The approaching first contact situation was bringing back all his old fears about protecting people under his command. She reminded him that this was a diplomatic mission, not a combat operation. The communications array crackled to life as the universal translator finally found patterns in the alien signals. A voice spoke in perfect English, though it sounded like multiple people talking at once. The Kirani welcomed the humans to their system and invited them to dock at the primary floating city for formal negotiations. Jake accepted the invitation, though something about the perfect unity in their voice made him uneasy. As the Valor approached the docking platform, Jake could see the Kirani waiting to greet them. They stood in perfect formation, their silver eyes reflecting the light from their city's crystal spires. Every movement was synchronized, as if they were all following the same invisible conductor. Even their breathing seemed to be in rhythm. Jake selected a small diplomatic team including Amy and Sergeant Carlos Rivera, his most trusted tactical officer. Carlos was a veteran like himself, scarred by battles but still believing in the mission to protect innocent people. The three of them had served together since the early days after Proxima, forming a bond forged in shared loss and determination. The airlock cycled and they stepped into a world that defied human understanding. The Kireni city floated on currents of pure energy, its buildings grown rather than built from living crystal. Bioluminescent gardens provided soft light, while streams of purified water flowed upward in defiance of gravity. Everything was beautiful and perfect and somehow wrong. High telepath Morthane approached them with measured steps, his tall form draped in robes that shifted color with his thoughts. His face was ageless and serene, bearing the kind of perfect symmetry that suggested genetic manipulation. When he spoke, his lips barely moved, but his voice filled their minds directly through some form of telepathic projection. He explained that the Kireni had achieved perfect unity by joining all their minds into a single collective consciousness. Individual thought was considered primitive and chaotic, something their species had evolved beyond centuries ago. They found human mental patterns fascinating but also deeply disturbing. Like looking at a disease they had cured long ago, the formal negotiations took place in the Grand Convergence Chamber, a massive room where thousands of Kireni gathered to witness the historic meeting. Their collective attention felt like pressure against Jake's mind, making him dizzy and disoriented. Amy and Carlos seemed to be experiencing similar effects. Their faces pale and strained. Morthane attempted to establish deeper mental contact with the human delegation, but the chaotic nature of individual consciousness made the connection painful for both species. The Kireni found human thoughts loud and discordant, while the humans felt like their minds were being invaded by alien presence. The cultural gap seemed almost impossible to bridge. As the discussions continued, Jake became aware of movement. In the upper galleries, security forces were converging on something or someone, their synchronized movements creating ripples of disturbance through the collective consciousness. The distraction was minor but noticeable, like a single instrument playing out of tune in a perfect orchestra. Suddenly a figure stumbled into the chamber through a maintenance access, pursued by armed guards in black armor. It was a Kireni female, but unlike any Jake had seen before. Her eyes were mismatched silver and gold, her skin pale and marked with shifting patterns. She moved with desperate fear, looking around for an escape route that didn't exist. The collective consciousness reacted with revulsion and anger. Thousands of voices spoke as one, demanding the immediate removal of the defective individual who dared to contaminate their sacred space. The guards raised their weapons, energy crackling along the barrels as they prepared to execute her on the spot. Jake had seen that look of desperate terror before, in the eyes of civilians caught in war zones who had nowhere left to run. Without thinking, he stepped forward and placed himself between the guards and the frightened alien. His hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, though he knew it would be useless against the overwhelming numbers surrounding them. Morthane's perfect composure cracked for the first time as he explained that the creature was void-touched, genetically defective and dangerous to their collective harmony. She had been marked for purification months ago, but had somehow evaded capture until now. Her very existence was an affront to everything the Kireni had achieved. Jake looked into the alien woman's mismatched eyes and saw something he recognized. The same hopeless isolation he had felt after losing his squad, the same desperate need for someone to stand up and say that her life mattered. He had failed his soldiers, but he wouldn't fail her. Not when he had the power to make a difference. The standoff stretched across long seconds as hundreds of weapons trained on the small group of humans. Amy and Carlos moved to flank their captain, their loyalty absolute despite the hopeless odds. Jake kept his eyes on the trembling alien woman and made a decision that would change the course of history. He declared her under the protection of the Terran Defense Fleet. The tension in the Grand Convergence Chamber could have been cut with a blade. Jake Morrison kept his hand steady on his weapon while facing down hundreds of Kireni guards, their energy rifles humming with deadly power. Behind him, the alien woman named Zaravel pressed herself against the wall, her mismatched eyes wide with disbelief that anyone would risk their life for her. High Telepath Morthane's perfect composure had completely shattered. His voice echoed through the chamber without the usual collective harmony, revealing the individual anger beneath his telepathic mask. He demanded that Jake surrender the defective creature immediately or face the full wrath of the Kerani fleet. The floating cities above them began to pulse with warning lights as Warmind. Keth Naros prepared for battle. Amy Chun stepped closer to her captain, her medical scanner discreetly analyzing the alien woman's condition. What she found surprised her. The creature's neural patterns were indeed different from other Kerani, but they weren't damaged or broken as the collective claimed. Instead, they showed signs of enhanced activity in areas that other Kerani had suppressed. It was like comparing a wild symphony to a single repeating note. Sergeant Carlos Rivera watched the guard formations with a tactical eye, counting weapons and exit points out of habit. The situation was hopeless from a military standpoint, but he had served with Jake long enough to trust his captain's judgment. If Jake thought this alien was worth protecting, then Carlos would stand with him until the end. The standoff continued for several minutes before Jake made an unexpected move. He holstered his weapon and approached Zaravel slowly, his hands visible and empty. She flinched when he came near, expecting pain from any contact with another being. Her broken telepathic abilities made physical proximity agonizing with most creatures, but when Jake gently touched her shoulder, something amazing happened. Instead of the usual wave of mental noise and pain, she felt only calm warmth. Human minds were so different from Kerani consciousness that they didn't trigger her neural damage. For the first time in her life, she experienced peaceful contact. With another intelligent being, Jake spoke to her in simple words, using the translation device to convert his speech into basic Kerani. He told her that his people believed every life had value, regardless of differences or defects. He promised that no harm would come to her while she remained under human protection, even if it meant war between their species. The collective consciousness buzzed with confusion and anger at this development. They couldn't understand why advanced beings would risk themselves for a genetically inferior specimen. In their perfect society, the needs of the many always outweighed the needs of the few. Individual sacrifice for collective improvement was the foundation of their civilization. Morthane tried one final diplomatic solution. He offered Jake access to Kerani technology and trade agreements in exchange for surrendering the void-touched female. Their bio-crystal energy sources and consciousness-linking devices would advance human science by centuries. All he asked was that they allow nature to take its course with defective genetics. Jake's response was swift and final. He explained that humanity had once tried to eliminate differences and imperfections from their species. The results had been wars, genocide, and suffering beyond measure. They had learned that diversity and individual thought were strengths, not weaknesses. No amount of technology was worth abandoning those principles. The negotiations broke down completely as Keth Naros announced that the Kerani fleet was taking aggressive positions around the human ship. 3 massive vessels powered by collective willpower could easily destroy the single Terran cruiser. Jake had minutes to decide whether to fight a hopeless battle or abandon the alien woman to her fate. As they prepared to return to the Valor, Zaravel grabbed Jake's arm with surprising strength. Her fractured telepathic abilities were picking up fragments of communication from the underground tunnels. She told him in broken English about the other outcasts hiding in the ruins, dozens of void-touched Kerani who lived in constant fear of the purification squads. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. This wasn't about saving one alien woman, it was about an entire population of refugees hiding from systematic elimination. His mind flashed back to intelligence reports about ethnic cleansing on distant worlds, situations where the Terran defense fleet had arrived too late to make a difference. Amy Chun was already running medical scans and taking biological samples from Zaravel with her permission. The data showed that the so-called genetic defects were actually beneficial mutations that enhanced creativity and individual problem-solving abilities. The Kerani Collective had been eliminating the very traits that could help their species adapt and grow. Carlos Rivera studied the city's defensive systems while they walked back to the docking platform. His tactical experience told him that a direct assault would be suicide, but he also noticed weaknesses in their synchronized response patterns. Systems designed for collective consciousness might be vulnerable to chaos and individual initiative. Back aboard the Valor, Jake called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. The moral implications were clear, but the practical problems seemed insurmountable. They were one ship against an entire civilization, with no backup and no way to evacuate dozens of refugees without being detected. Zaravel sat in the corner of the briefing room, overwhelmed by her first experience aboard a human vessel. Everything was different from Cairney technology. Where they used organic biocrystals and telepathic interfaces, humans relied on mechanical systems and individual operation. She watched in fascination as the crew members worked independently while still coordinating their efforts. Amy brought her food and water, simple gestures that meant everything to someone who had survived on scraps and crystal nutrients. The human woman's kindness was genuine, and without the collective conditioning that made other Cairney treat her like a disease. For the first time in her life, Zaravel felt like she might actually belong somewhere. Jake made his decision as alerts began sounding throughout the ship. The Cairney fleet was powering weapons and demanding immediate surrender of the defective alien. He could abandon her and save his crew, or he could trust in human ingenuity and the principles that made their species worth defending. He chose to fight, not with weapons, but with the one thing the collective consciousness couldn't understand: the power of individual courage in the face of impossible odds. The alarm bells on the TDF Valor rang out across all decks as the Cairney fleet moved into attack formation. Jake Morrison stood in his ready room with Zaravel, watching her work at a portable computer terminal that Amy Chun had set up for her. The alien woman's damaged telepathic abilities allowed her to interface with technology in ways that amazed the human crew. Her fingers moved across the holographic display with practiced ease, accessing ancient Cairney databases that the collective consciousness had forgotten. The information she uncovered painted a disturbing picture of systematic elimination that had been going on for generations. Thousands of void-touched individuals had been quietly removed from society, their existence erased from official records. Jake studied the tactical situation on his command screen while Zaravel worked. 3 Cairney vessels surrounded his ship, their biocrystal hulls pulsing with enough energy to reduce the Valor to debris in minutes. His crew of 200 faced impossible odds, but he had made his choice. No one else would die on his watch. If he could prevent it. Zaravel looked up from her work with excitement burning in her mismatched eyes. She had found something important in the old data files: information about a network of underground tunnels that connected all the major cities on Vethra Prime. The ancient transportation system had been abandoned when the Cairney developed their floating cities, but it was still functional. She explained in her broken English that the tunnel system could be accessed through maintenance ports in each city's foundation. The collective consciousness rarely monitored these areas because they considered them obsolete and unimportant. It was the perfect way to move undetected through Cairney territory and reach the hidden refuges where other outcasts waited. Amy Chun brought them both food and medical supplies while they planned their rescue operation. She had been running continuous scans on Zaravel, and the results were fascinating. The alien woman's neural pathways showed adaptation patterns that suggested her brain was evolving beyond standard Cairney limitations. Her defects were actually beneficial mutations that enhanced problem-solving abilities. Carlos Rivera joined them with a tactical assessment of the Cairney defenses. Their collective consciousness made them incredibly efficient at coordinated tasks, but it also created predictable patterns that could be exploited. Individual initiative and chaos were their greatest weaknesses because the collective couldn't adapt quickly to unexpected situations. Jake made his decision as another warning came from the Cairney fleet. Instead of fighting the massive vessels in open space, they would take the battle to the planet's surface using stealth and surprise. Zaravel would guide them through the tunnel systems to locate the hidden outcasts, while his crew created distractions to keep the collective consciousness occupied. The plan required splitting his forces, something that went against every military doctrine Jake had learned. But Zaravel convinced him that the outcasts would never trust strangers without her presence. She was the only void-touched individual who had managed to survive above ground for so long, making her a legend among the hidden refugees. Lieutenant Amy Chun volunteered to lead the medical team that would treat the rescued outcasts. Her portable equipment could handle basic trauma care and psychiatric support for beings who had lived in constant terror. She also brought genetic analysis tools to document the beneficial mutations that the collective consciousness was trying to eliminate. Sergeant Carlos Rivera took command of the tactical team responsible for creating diversions throughout the floating cities. His soldiers were experts at guerrilla warfare, trained to cause maximum confusion with minimal resources. They would strike fast and disappear before the collective consciousness could coordinate an effective response. Jake himself would accompany Zaravel into the deepest tunnels where the most vulnerable outcasts were hiding. His presence would demonstrate human commitment to protecting the innocent, while her knowledge of the underground networks would keep them alive. Together they represented the alliance between their species. The first part of their plan involved getting to the planet's surface without being detected by the Kirani fleet. Zaravel accessed the city's docking systems and created false maintenance schedules that would allow small human shuttles to land unnoticed. Her unique abilities made the deception impossible for the collective consciousness to detect. As the shuttles launched from the Valor's hidden bays, Jake felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was risking everything on the word of an alien outcast and the hope that human determination could overcome impossible odds. The memory of his lost squad haunted him, but this time he had a chance to save lives instead of watching them die. The underground tunnels were even more extensive than Zaravel had described. Miles of crystal-lined passages connected every major population center on Vethra Prime, a testament to the engineering skills of the ancient Kirani before they joined the collective consciousness. Bioluminescent fungi provided dim light while streams of pure water carried nutrients throughout the system. They encountered the first group of outcasts in a chamber deep beneath the capital city. 12 void-touched Kirani huddled around a failing biocrystal, their faces gaunt from malnutrition and their eyes hollow from constant fear. When they saw Zaravel approaching with an alien stranger, several of them tried to flee deeper into the tunnels. She spoke to them in their own language, explaining that the humans had come to help. Jake demonstrated his peaceful intentions by offering food and medical supplies, simple gestures that meant everything to beings who had been hunted for so long. Slowly, the outcasts began to trust, drawn by the hope of finally finding safety. Amy Chun's medical team treated injuries and malnutrition while documenting the genetic variations that made these beings special. Each outcast had unique abilities that the collective consciousness considered dangerous. Some could interface with ancient technology like Zaravel, while others showed enhanced creativity and individual problem-solving skills. Meanwhile, Carlos Rivera's tactical teams were causing chaos throughout the floating cities. They disabled communication nodes and created false alarms that sent purification squads running in circles. The collective consciousness struggled to coordinate responses to multiple simultaneous threats, exactly as Carlos had predicted. As they moved through the tunnel network rescuing more outcasts, Jake began to understand the true scope of what the Kirani had lost. These individuals represented genetic diversity and creative potential that the collective had been systematically eliminating. Their society had achieved perfect unity by destroying everything that made them adaptable and strong. The rescue operation was succeeding beyond their wildest hopes, but Jake knew that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. High Telepath Morthane would not allow this humiliation to continue, and the collective consciousness possessed weapons that could sterilize the entire planet rather than let the outcasts escape. The central command chamber beneath Vethra Prime hummed with ancient power as Zaravel worked frantically at the master control console. Her damaged neural pathways burned with pain as she interfaced with technology that had been dormant for centuries, but she pushed through the agony. Above them, High Telepath Morthane was preparing to activate the mind weapon that would lobotomize every individual consciousness on the planet. Jake Morrison stood guard at the chamber entrance, his rifle trained on the tunnel that led to the surface. The rescue operation had been more successful than they had dared hope, with over 40 outcasts now safely aboard human shuttles heading for the Valor, but their success had driven the collective consciousness to desperate measures that threatened everyone on Vethra Prime. Amy Chun coordinated the final evacuation from her mobile command post, her medical team working around the clock to treat refugees who had spent years hiding in the tunnels. Many of the outcasts were severely malnourished and traumatized, but they showed remarkable resilience once they realized they were truly safe. Their genetic diversity represented hope for both species. Carlos Rivera's tactical teams had achieved their goal of creating chaos throughout the floating cities, but the cost was becoming apparent. The collective consciousness was adapting to their guerrilla tactics faster than expected, and several human soldiers had been captured during their diversionary attacks. Time was running out for everyone involved in the Operation. War-Mind Kethnaros appeared at the far end of the tunnel with a squad of elite guards, their armor gleaming with bio-crystal enhancement. He had tracked the human infiltrators through the ancient passages and come to end their interference personally. His face was a mask of cold fury as he raised his energy weapon and demanded Jake's immediate surrender. Jake had faced impossible odds before, but never with so many innocent lives depending on his actions. The memory of his lost squad gave him strength as he opened fire on the advancing Kerani forces. His rifle carved bright lines through the crystal-lined tunnel while he called for Zaravel to hurry with her work at the control console. She was deep in the ancient computer system, following data pathways that her fractured telepathy could navigate but the collective consciousness could not. The mind weapon was a relic from the early days of Kerani unity, designed to force individual minds into collective harmony. Morthane planned to use it on a planetary scale, erasing every trace of genetic diversity that remained. The battle in the tunnel was fierce but brief. Jake's military training and superior weapons gave him an advantage over guards who relied on collective coordination. When Kethnaros fell with a plasma burn across his chest, the remaining soldiers retreated. In confusion, their shared consciousness had never prepared them for individual combat against a determined human warrior, but victory came at a price that Jake felt in his bones. Shrapnel from a Kerani energy blast had torn through his left leg and blood was pooling beneath him as he struggled to remain upright. Amy Chen's voice crackled through his comm unit, reporting that the evacuation was nearly complete but they needed more time to reach minimum safe distance. Zaravel cried out in triumph as she found the weapons control protocols buried deep in the ancient database. Her unique neural pathways allowed her to understand the individual programming beneath the collective interface, revealing how the device could be turned against itself. But disabling it would require her to channel the full power of the planetary network through her damaged mind. Jake crawled to her side as warning klaxons began sounding throughout the chamber. The mind weapon was powering up in the floating cities above, its bio-crystal arrays focusing enough telepathic energy to rewrite the neural patterns of every living being on Vethra Prime. Even humans would not be immune to its effects at full power. She looked at him with her mismatched eyes, knowing that what she was about to attempt would likely destroy her forever. Her fractured telepathy had been a curse her entire life, but now it was the only thing that could save both their species. Jake gripped her hand and told her that she was the bravest person he had ever met. The chamber filled with blinding light as Zaravel opened her mind to the planetary network. Every bio-crystal on Vethra Prime responded to her call, their energy flowing through neural pathways that had never been designed to handle such power. The collective consciousness screamed in confusion as individual thoughts began echoing through their shared awareness. For the first time in centuries, every Kerani on the planet experienced what it meant to be alone inside their own head. The sensation was terrifying and liberating at the same time, like waking up from a dream they had forgotten was artificial. Some embraced the change while others fought desperately to reconnect to the collective that had defined their existence. Hi. Telepath Morthane felt his perfect unity crumbling as individual thoughts invaded his mind. He tried to activate the mind weapon manually, but Zaravel's interference had corrupted the control systems beyond repair. The device that was meant to enforce collective harmony was tearing the network apart from within. Jake watched helplessly. As energy coursed through Zaravel's body, her neural pathways overloading from the strain of channeling planetary-scale power. Her skin glowed with bioluminescent patterns that told the story of her people's forgotten history, the individual creativity they had sacrificed for false unity. She was beautiful and terrifying and completely alone in her sacrifice. The mind weapon exploded in a cascade of crystal fragments and psychic feedback that shattered windows throughout the floating cities. The collective consciousness network collapsed completely, leaving millions of Kireni to face individual existence for the first time in their lives. Some would adapt and thrive, while others would struggle to find meaning without the shared thoughts that had guided them when the light faded. Jake found Zaravel unconscious but alive in his arms. Her neural pathways had been permanently altered. By the experience, her telepathic abilities reduced to barely functional levels. But she was free from the constant pain that had plagued her since birth, and her sacrifice had given both species a chance at a better future. 3 months later, Jake sat on the observation deck of New Haven Colony and watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. His injured leg had healed enough for him to walk without assistance, though he would never return to active military duty. Beside him, Zaravel worked on a translation device that would help other outcasts communicate with their human allies. The colony was thriving with refugees from both species who had chosen individual freedom over collective security. Former Kireni soldiers worked alongside human engineers to build homes and schools, while void-touched outcasts shared their unique abilities to solve problems that neither species could handle alone. It was messy and chaotic and absolutely perfect. Zaravel looked up from her work and smiled at Jake with genuine happiness. She told him that she had finally learned what it meant to belong somewhere. Not because she fit a perfect mold, but because her differences were valued and celebrated. He squeezed her hand gently and watched their two species building something new together under the alien stars.